Hi everybody. Hi Dolores. Hi Jeffrey Denton. And hi Greg Mallard. I see you're here. And I also see a whole lot of shares already here. So thank you very much for those who shared. Uh, I guess we'll wait for a minute or so and oh, well, there are actually 6 people here. So I guess that's enough for me to get started. So, okay, I will get started. The topic for tonight is who will who would FDR endorse? So, I suppose what we really have to ask is who would the spirits of FDR endorse? Who would the people who have the spirit of FDR inside them endorse? Well, there was a bit of an article asking that question, which appeared in Truth Dig, or at least that's where I saw it. And the title of it was Who Would FDR Endorse? And it was written October 1st, or published anyway, October 1st by Connor Lynch. So let me shift to the view where you can see the page. And let me block out the extraneous items on the page. And Lynch, of course, talks about how Senator Warren drew a massive crowd of supporters in New York last week. I guess that was now nearly 2 weeks ago. A massive crowd of both supporters and curious bystanders. And Senator Warren evoked the legacy of Frances Perkins, the longest serving Secretary of Labor and the first female member of the presidential cabinet. Frances Perkins was quite a lady, quite an effective person, and very, very important person in Roosevelt's cabinet, a very, very important person as an advisor, okay, of Franklin Roosevelt's as well. Practically legendary in her time. I'll continue with this in just a minute. I want to make sure that my sound and visuals are going okay. Hi, Cora. Hi, Robin Halsey. And hi, honey. I'm saying honey to Bonnie, of course. Uh, okay, anyway, how do I sound? Hi, Christy Yasny. Nice to see you. How are my sound and visuals, everybody? Please let me know so I can go away from this mess. So Bonnie's telling me they're good, but how about you out there? Okay, I'm going to assume they're good. If some of you say they're not, I'm sure. Greg says I can carry on. Okay, thank you, Greg, and Dolores. Thank you both. So I will carry on. Here we are once again. So the Warren campaign's decision to stage a speech at the famous park in Lower Manhattan was inspired partly by the fact that it's a block away from the infamous Triangle Shirtwaist factory, where 146 garment workers, most of them young immigrant women, died in a fire in 1911. The disaster, as Warren told her audience, prompted um, very major reforms, which Perkins was instrumental in pushing. As the presidential candidate put it in her speech, the presidential candidate being Senator Warren, quote, with Francis working the system from the inside, the women workers organizing and applying pressure from the outside. They rewrote New York State's labor laws from top to bottom to protect the workers. They did. And from there, they greatly influenced also the nation's labor laws as well. 20 years later, Franklin D. Roosevelt selected Perkins as his labor secretary. She had also been a prominent advisor of him in New York State, I believe, before then, when he was governor of New York. And she held that position during his entire presidency. And the administration passed everything from Social Security and unemployment insurance to the minimum wage and the Wagner Act, which guaranteed the rights of labor to organize. Yes, she was instrumental in all of those things. She was his chief advisor about all those things. That's how important she was. One, quote, very persistent woman, Warren declared, unquote, or unquote, I should say, Warren declared, and then, quote, backed up by millions of people across the country. They achieved major structural reforms that had a transformative effect on the country. Just as we now seek major structural reforms that have a transformative effect on the country right now. Warren isn't the first 2020 Democratic candidate to give a major speech on the legacy of the New Deal. In June, in his widely discussed speech on democratic socialism, Senator Bernie Sanders repeatedly invoked FDR and his, quote, bold and visionary leadership, unquote, as an example for what we need today. And we have to keep in mind that Bernie is old enough. At 78, he was born in 1941, that he may remember Roosevelt. He may have heard him speak on the radio as a young child. Given the family background he had, he certainly must have heard his parents speaking about FDR in very supportive and very affectionate and very generous terms when he was a child. I was born in 1939. I didn't live in Brooklyn as Bernie did. I lived in the Bronx. But I grew up with FDR and with his memory in my household as well. Though some commentators, including me, said McConnor Lynch, questioned the Vermont Senator's decision to make FDR and New Deal about liberalism the focal point of a speech about democratic socialism, which presumably goes beyond FDR's brand of social democracy, which was a program designed to preserve and stabilize American capitalism, not to replace it. From a strategic standpoint, it makes perfect sense to employ Roosevelt as a model for the kind of leadership needed in the 21st century. And Bernie has certainly done that by saying with Roosevelt, "They hate me, and I welcome their hatred." FDR, along with members of his administration like Perkins, fought for transformative change that was, in Sanders' words, opposed by big business, Wall Street, the political establishment, by the Republican Party, and by the conservative wing of FDR's own Democratic Party, unquote. At the time, FDR was called everything from a fascist to a communist, and he had to deal with smears from members of his own party, such as 1928 Democratic presidential candidate Al Smith, who founded a group called the Liberty League to oppose the New Deal. At a 1936 rally of the Liberty League, Smith gave a then 27-year-old Joseph R. McCarthy a template for his future tactics, painting Roosevelt as a Bolshevik in disguise. Quote, "There can be only one capital," he said, "Washington or Moscow. There can be only the clear, pure, fresh air of free America or the foul breath of communistic Russia. There can be only one flag, the Stars and Stripes, or the flag of the godless Union of the Soviets," unquote, said the infamous man with the infamous 5 o'clock shadow that served to immortalize in infamy the older Joe McCarthy. He was given the 5 o'clock shadow. Well, he had the 5 o'clock shadow, but he was given it in memory by the cartoons of Herbert Block, the liberal cartoonist for the New York Post, which during the 1940s, the 1950s, and the 1960s at least, I don't know when it changed, but it was owned by extremely liberal people all through that particular period. Okay, and McCarthy was the devil to them. This was before the Post was bought by Rupert Murdoch, I believe. Changed its spots continuously. FDR and his administration didn't just face ad hominem political attacks, but institutional barriers that threatened to make real structural reform impossible. With a conservative majority, the Supreme Court ruled numerous New Deal policies unconstitutional and stood in the way of any kind of economic reform. At one point, historian Jeff Sheasole tells us in his 2010 book, quote, "Supreme Power, Franklin Roosevelt versus the Supreme Court," unquote, FDR thought that the court would, quote, nullify virtually everything of significance that the administration had done, unquote. This thought didn't lead FDR to despair, however, as he believed that after The 9 old men overruled his popular reforms. It wouldn't be long before the nation's streets were filled with marching farmers, marching miners, and marching factory workers, unquote. In other words, Roosevelt was prepared for a fight and counted on popular support against the so-called, quote, economic uh, economic royalists, unquote. There would always be those who cried, quote, unconstitutional, unquote, at, quote, every effort to better the condition of our people, said Roosevelt in 1937. Such cries have always been with us, and ultimately they have always been overruled, unquote. Roosevelt's struggle with the Supreme Court culminated with his plan to add more justices to the court, which ultimately failed, but not before the court. Justice Owen Roberts, in particular, shifted its tune on New Deal legislation. And yes, sirree, there was a conservative Justice Roberts at that time as well. He was one of a group called the Four Horsemen. They were named after the famous backfield of the Notre Dame football team, and also the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse: war, pestilence, famine. I forget what the fourth horseman, who the horseman was, but I remember the football four horsemen: Stuhldreher, Miller, Crowley, and Layden, if I recall correctly. The Notre Dame Four Horsemen. Anyway, I digress. So, the court shifted its tune at that time, fearful that Roosevelt would be successful with his court packing plan sooner or later. They became fearful of defying the majority will. But we have to note that Roosevelt, in 1937, was riding the wave of an unprecedented electoral victory in 1936 that was fueled by movements on the ground supporting him, the kinds of movements that Bernie is trying to build right now. I don't know. Right now, we may be more amenable to packing the Supreme Court. I think a lot of us certainly believe that a lot of the appointments of the Supreme Court were illegitimate because the justices lied to the Senate during their confirmation hearings. I personally believe that Kavanaugh, Neil Gorsuch, Sam Alito, and Clarence Thomas perhaps all lied to the Senate during their confirmation hearings. Grounds for impeachment. If there were enough anti-Supreme Court people in the House and in the Senate, there might well be such a move. But I'm sure along the way, if that were attempted, some people would come up with an alternative plan to pack the court instead and leave those current justices but sitting there. I personally would prefer impeachment because this is another area where a moral hazard has to be ended. Specifically, going to your confirmation hearing and lying to the court and getting away and lying to the Senate and getting away with it is a moral hazard. And we've been allowing people to do that in one way or another since the 1980s. Since Bork told the truth and then famously was borked by the Democrats. Anyway, again, I digress. Both Warren and Sanders have invoked FDR and the New Deal, not just because of policies, but because of the aggressive style of politics that Roosevelt and his team employed to achieve such transformative change. FDR wasn't afraid of being denounced as a communist or a dictator by right-wing detractors, and he eagerly embraced conflict with the wealthy business leaders who funded such groups as the Liberty League. But FDR used the bully pulpit to push his progressive agenda and famously welcomed the hatred of his opponents who stood against economic and political reform widely supported by the American people. Just as many progressive reforms are today. One of the most frequent criticisms leveled at that are leveled at progressive candidates, often from centrists who claim to sympathize with their agenda, is that their plans are unrealistic and will never make it past Congress, let alone the Supreme Court. Reporting on Warren's speech at Washington Square Park, The Atlantic's Russell Berman observed that while Warren's policy plans are detailed and specific, her strategy for achieving them is less so. Like Sanders, Warren calls for a sustained grassroots movement to pressure Washington. But according to Berman, quote, that was also Obama's plea. And while the former president was able to enact the Affordable Care Act, Wall Street reforms, I might add here, very minimal Wall Street reforms, nor was the Affordable Care Act of enormous significance when he could very well have passed the Medicare for All bill, but we'll get into that in just a little while. And a large economic stimulus package early in his tenure, large but inadequate, too little, much, much too little, by about $1 trillion. His entreaties for outside help did not succeed in pressuring Republicans to support his plans, unquote. That's true, but it's also true that he did not need to have Republicans support his plans because he had huge majorities on the Democratic side in both houses of Congress. If he had had the will, he could have passed anything he wanted to pass. This is the conventional wisdom one often hears today about the Obama years. Connor Lynch points out that it's the conventional wisdom. And while it is certainly true that President Obama faced unprecedented Republican obstructionism, it is simply false to claim that the 44th president fought aggressively for a progressive agenda and did everything he could to push for radical change. Even before he entered office, Obama had settled on a, quote, pragmatic, unquote, response to the financial crisis, hiring centrist and neoliberal ideologues like Timothy Geithner, Larry Summers, and Rahm Emanuel, while desperately working to achieve a, quote, post-partisan, unquote, consensus, which was far more naive than the progressive approach towards movement building. I think that particular diagnosis is accurate. It is accurate. It also bears saying, though, as well, that he was right to put the scare quotes around pragmatic because it was Obama's strategy and his attempts at making a pragmatic response that turned out to be entirely unpragmatic because the response did not work. Key point, okay, in evidence. The Republicans swept into office by winning the election of 2010. And Obama's control of the drift of things within the federal government seemed to end. Of course, there are people who believe, including myself, that since Obama was a neoliberal himself anyway, he actually got what he wanted, and perhaps that is true. But I'm sure there were a lot of things about the catastrophic defeat, okay, the Democrats suffered in 2010 that did not make Obama a happy man for the rest of his tenure in the presidency. Even though he seems to be a happy man very now, as long as he's cashing in on the Wall Street money. But the truth of the matter is that from the standpoint of building the Democratic Party, and from the standpoint of actually building the progressive movement, and from the standpoint of building a legacy, the kind of legacy that FDR had, and the kind of honor that FDR had, that was a very unpragmatic response on the part of the president. It would have been much more pragmatic to have passed a $2 trillion stimulus bill, almost entirely focused on high multiplier fiscal stimuli, followed up very, very quickly with H.R. 676, the 2009 version of the Medicare for All bill, written and introduced by John Conyers, then proceeded very quickly to a credit card reform bill, which held credit card interest rates to a maximum of 6%, shall we say, and perhaps 5% over prime. Then a financial regulations bill to repeal the repeal of the Glass-Steagall Act, and to repeal the Financial Commodities Modernization Act of 1999, which allowed and led to all the gambling on Wall Street that in turn led to the crash of 2008, and then proceeded on with bills to reform the educational system in our country, introduce free college right then and there, take care of the student debt problem right then and there, and come to grips with the climate crisis right then and there. If Obama had done that in his first 2 years in office, by the time November 2010 had rolled around, he and the Democrats would have been heroes, and they would have increased their margins both in the House and the Senate. And the Republican Party most probably would have split and died. But Obama gave all that up. All that up. One notable example of the Obama administration's timid response was its failure to push for legislation that would have allowed judges to modify the terms of home mortgages, colloquially known as, quote, cram down, unquote. As David Badayan reported in 2015, it was within Obama's power to prevent millions of people from losing their homes, just as it was within the administration's power to criminally prosecute bank executives for their fraudulent behavior. Quote, this is all true, by the way. Quote, the administration's eventual program, HAMP, grew out of the banking industry's preferred alternative to cram down, one where the industry, rather than bankruptcy judges, would control loan restructuring, unquote. Quote again, unfortunately, the program has been a success for bankers and a failure for most hard-pressed homeowners, unquote. Indeed, I think it was a failure for 7 million of them who had their homes foreclosed on. Now, that is a monumental failure that should go down in history. And it is Obama's failure and the failure of the Democrats. The idea that Obama was once a populist and that a Warren or Sanders administration would end up just like the Obama administration did is simply wrong. The two leading progressive candidates have already expressed a willingness to adopt the Rooseveltian style of politics that Obama was never willing to adopt. And the 44th president never favored the structural changes that the former do. I am prepared to go to every state in this union and rally the American people around a progressive agenda to put pressure on their representatives, whether they are Democratic or Republican, unquote, Sanders recently remarked in an interview, saying that he would also support primary challenges to Democrats who are not supportive of policies such as Medicare for all. This is an aggressive strategy in the tradition of Roosevelt, and it's the only strategy that could potentially lead to his progressive agenda becoming a reality in the future. And now this is a comment. So, do we see Senator Warren saying that she would also support primary challenges to Democrats who are not supportive of policies like the Medicare for All policy? Do we see that from her? Or do we see her waffling on Medicare for All? It is completely legitimate to ask, and back to the article again, how progressives would pass major legislation without a supermajority in Congress. And the fact is that Roosevelt had much more favorable circumstances in 1933 than any Democratic president is likely to have in the foreseeable future. There are certain measures that could give Democrats some more wiggle room. Warren has advocated eliminating the filibuster, for example, while Sanders has curiously rejected this approach, favoring the complicated budget reconciliation process instead. This is true, and so it can be asked, okay, of Bernie, why refrain from eliminating the filibuster? What is it about the filibuster we must have? Now, Bernie has tried to answer that. I suspect the answer is he wants to continue to provide a platform for dissent on the Senate floor. I don't think Bernie is for the filibuster in its present form. I think he's for modifying it to turn the clock back before 19. I think the Byrd Rule was adopted in 1977 before the Byrd Rule was adopted, which allows the senators just to say they oppose a bill rather than actually getting on the floor to filibuster for it. I think that Bernie Sanders wants to preserve the possibility of the kinds of moments we see in the film Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, okay, and which Bernie imagines that he would have flourished in that kind of environment, uh, where he probably would have done a filibuster every week, which would have lasted a week, but knowing him. Okay. But really, I think there are many platforms that are open to dissenters these days that were not open at that time, that were not open in 1974. There are whole social media platforms. There are ways to raise money without going to the big donors, as he very well knows. You don't have to filibuster on the Senate floor any longer. The intentions of the framers were to make the Senate a majority vote institution, and it technically still is, since in every session the filibuster rule has to be reenacted by the Senate. It always is. What we need to do is to make it a politically unpalatable rule to pass. And here we need to side with the advocacy of Warren to eliminate the filibuster. Now, I'm not sure I believe for a minute that Warren is going to go ahead and eliminate the filibuster. But I know that if Bernie gave a commitment to do that, then he would. He would follow through. He would do it. He would get it done. Connor Lynch continues, none of this will matter, however, if progressive Democrats don't manage to create a wave of popular enthusiasm for their agenda. Absolutely correct. It's got to be more than a wave of popular enthusiasm for their agenda, though. It's got to be overwhelming enthusiasm for Bernie's agenda and for Bernie. Because Bernie has to be the presidential candidate that we can vote for in 2020. And he has to be the president in 2021, come hell or high water, because he's the only one we can trust to meet the climate emergency, hammer and tongs, and to do whatever is necessary to overcome it and to save the lives of our children and our grandchildren. It is important for progressive leaders, says Lynch, to be honest and forthright about this to their supporters. None of their proposals stands a chance without a popular movement that goes well beyond the election cycle. FDR understood the power of popular will. Perhaps it is time for Democrats to refresh their memory. In my view, the end of this article by Connor Lynch, though it has much to recommend it, is underwhelming. Obviously, the person to endorse, obviously, the choice of the progressive movement. Listen up, Workers' Family Party, you traitors. Listen up. The obvious popular choice, the obvious person to endorse, is not Waffler Warren. It is the steadfast Bernie Sanders. He's the one. who can lead the popular movement, who can inspire a popular movement, as he's doing now with his own campaign. As the months go by, that movement in back of that agenda will grow and grow and grow. We all need to continue to be a part of it. And we need to make sure that the primary works out for us all. And if it doesn't work out for us all, then we need to quickly move the movement to an alternative, like the movement for a People's Party, and get all our candidates to move to. So, who would FDR endorse? Okay, is done. What I'd like to do now is to move to another article, which is a case in point, which relates closely to the Who Would FDR Endorse article. It is entitled Elizabeth Warren's Student Debt Plan Can't Compare to Sanders. And it was written by Richard J. Eskow, one of my favorite writers on the progressive side, and someone who's to be found on some of the panel discussions held here by Economics for Peace and Security. He's well known and is also well liked by Stephanie Kelton and by Jamie Galbraith. So Richard, RJ as he is often known, points out that Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren have both offered proposals to cancel student debt. A nearly $1.6 trillion burden on borrowers and a major drag on the economy. While both are aggressive attempts to address the student debt crisis, there is a major difference between the two plans. The Sanders plan is likely to create at least 1 million more jobs than Warren's, since it cancels roughly $1 trillion more in our outstanding debts. The figure of 1 million additional jobs was derived from the conclusions of a 2018 report from the Levy Economics Institute at Bard College, which used widely accepted macroeconomic models, the FAIR and Moody's models, to project the macroeconomic effect of canceling all student debt. The Levy report, which is linked to in the article, used a start date in 2017 for its projections. And by the way, the Levy report called The Macroeconomic Effects of Student Debt Cancellation was written by Scott Fulwiler, Stephanie Kelton, Catherine Ruchlin, and Marshall Steinbaum. It was published in February of 2018. And of course, Scott Fulwiler and Stephanie Kelton, both are MMT economists. As for Marshall Steinbaum, he's a progressive economist, and I don't know where Catherine Ruchland stands, and I'm not sure that I pronounced her name correctly either, but I certainly tried. So, what's being quoted favorably here is a study led by two of the most prominent of the modern money theory school of economics, specifically Stephanie Kelton and Scott Fullwiler. As the graph below shows, the models used in the Levy report show that several million jobs are created by the cancellation of all student debt. The exact amount varies depending on the economic model used. Averaging these figures, the report shows that approximately 4.4 million jobs would be created by full cancellation in the first 5 years. Using these figures, it's possible to approximate the differing effects of the Warren and Sanders plan with the following steps. First, reducing the Levy report's numbers by 60% gives us something in the neighborhood of 2.6 million fewer jobs under Warren's plan. Given that the debt is now larger than it was in the Levy study, that number could be bumped by 10 or 15%. That calculation, however, is too crude. It's fair to assume the stimulus effect of cancellation is greater on the lower end of the income spectrum, where urgent needs are going unmet, and would be somewhat smaller for the relatively well-off, although not wealthy households included in the Sanders plan. The multiplier effect of government stimulus measures is also likely to be smaller in the current economy. To ensure that these factors are considered, I have cut the job difference by nearly half to arrive at the figure of 1 million more jobs created with full cancellation. A conservative estimate, and a not unfair one. The idea that student debt cancellation creates jobs is intuitive as well. If 44 million student debt holders are relieved of their debt burden, they will have more money to spend each month for food, entertainment, and other purchases. They might even be able to qualify for homes. Studies have shown that student debt is also keeping younger people from forming households, which ironically means a lower benefit under the Warren plan if they're living with their parents. Household formation, which is the result of longer-term thinking concerning affordability, in turn means the purchase of home items, cars, and houses. With those factors in mind, I asked the lead author of the Levy report whether it would be safe to say that the Sanders plan would create 1 million more jobs than the Warren plan. And Professor Stephanie Kelton of Stony Brook University replied that a full study would be required to answer the question with confidence. But Kelton said the 1 million jobs figure, quote, looks reasonable, unquote. Kelton, an advisor to Senator Sanders, his chief economic advisor, as a matter of fact, is also a macroeconomist and professor. She is not employed by the campaign. Why it matters. Both proposals would create jobs for working people, and the additional 1 million from Sanders' plan would be useful. Despite today's, quote, excellent, unquote, job numbers, the working economy isn't as good as the headlines would have us believe. The number of open jobs, 7.2 million, is essentially unchanged from last year's and is declining slightly. That means there is relatively little pressure to pay workers more. Wage growth remains weak. It's not a great time to be a working person in this country. The biggest losers in this job economy are millennials, the same group that bears the heaviest burden of student debt. Student debt affects all adult age groups, including seniors, but falls heaviest on the younger adults. So millennials have become the largest generation in the American workforce and are still suffering the economic consequences of entering the workforce during the Great Recession. At 1.6 trillion, full student debt cancellation rivals Trump's tax cut in its scope. It would, however, be far more effective at creating jobs and stimulating the economy because if only Trump had been interested in this, correct? Oops, sorry, my page has gone away. At 1.6 trillion, okay, because the benefits of Trump's cuts were directed toward higher earners who have much less pressure to spend, the Trump cut left the trajectory of job growth essentially unchanged. The next section is called muddled debate. That distinction has been obscured in what has been, so far at least, a muddled debate. Headlines like Vice's Elizabeth Warren is taking her plan to cancel 75% of student debt to Congress have added to public confusion over the two candidates' plans. Warren's $640 billion proposal would in fact cancel only 40% of all outstanding student debt. The confusion has also been compounded, no doubt unintentionally, by Senator Warren's remark during her second presidential debate that her plan would, quote, cancel student debt for 95% of the people who have it, unquote. No doubt unintentionally. Just as her statement about, well, I'm not going to go into it. That statement, while true, could leave some listeners with the wrong impression. Warren's plan would cancel at least some student debt for 95% of debt holders and all debt for 75% of the borrowers. The source of Vice's erroneous headline. But some borrowers owe more than others, which is why Warren's plan leaves roughly $1 trillion of student debt in place. 25% of borrowers, more than 10 million people, would still have student debt under Warren's plan. Warren's plan, unlike Sanders', caps the amount to be canceled at $50,000 per person. That figure is progressively reduced for income above $100,000 per year per household until it reaches $250,000, at which point no cancellation is offered. But households making $100,000 a year are not necessarily prosperous. While they're not impoverished, a working couple, say a bus driver and a school teacher making $51,000 each, aren't especially well off by most standards, especially if they're raising children. He might have added, if they're raising children in the Washington area, or raising children in Los Angeles, or raising children in San Francisco, or raising children in a dozen other cities in the United States. If one or more children with student debt lives and works at home, their added income would further reduce the debt relief to a family that may well be struggling. But that's Warren. She wants to make things better, just not better enough. The desire, sorry, that was an editorial comment. Going on with R.J. Eskow's article, the desire to limit debt reductions for these households may have some tactical vote-seeking value, especially in a political culture that has directed intra-middle-class resentment toward better-off workers rather than the wealthy. That doesn't make it the best policy for working people of any age, race, or income level. In fact, because of its limits, Warren's plan will have a significantly smaller stimulus effect and will therefore help all workers somewhat less. Yes, because it would not tighten the labor market as much as it could. And here are the roots, K, of opposition. The point needs to be reiterated. Full student debt cancellation of the kind Sanders is proposing would create at least 1 million more jobs than the Warren plan. Why then would progressives oppose it? Some of the liberal opposition is often grounded in the mistaken belief that Warren's plan would do more to reduce the racial wealth gap than Warren's. The opposite is true. Full cancellation would reduce the racial wealth gap more than Warren's plan would, as economist Marshall Steinbaum, a co-author of the Levy Report, later concluded. Quote, the more debt cancellation there is, the more racial wealth inequality is reduced, at least among the plans that have actually been proposed. There's also a deep attachment to targeted economic programs in certain liberal circles, based on the sense that government programs should be focused solely on individuals in dire need. And he says, I wrote an essay in the American Prospect on that topic, and he links to it. The student debt cancellation, this is often framed as a desire to avoid helping the wealthy. But truly wealthy individuals are unlikely to hold student debt. If they have family wealth, there would have been no need to borrow for college. If they have subsequently become wealthy, their advisors have almost certainly told them to pay off student debt, which normally charges high interest rates. It's true, there are some mildly prosperous professionals who hold a large amount of student debt, but it takes a strange moral logic to deny jobs for a million working people out of fear that, say, a well-to-do orthodontist on Long Island might get a break she doesn't deserve. There is no such liberal compunction about infrastructure programs, for example, even though they could make a few construction executives wealthy as they create jobs for working people. The million-plus additional jobs created by a full cancellation would go to a broad array of working people in a range of fields, in industries that range from restaurants to sales, and from auto manufacturing to construction. A large percentage of them would go to people of color, which would further reduce the racial wealth gap at a time when the African American unemployment rate remains roughly double that of whites. To sum up, full cancellation creates at least 1 million more jobs than Warren's partial cancellation. Full cancellation does more to reduce the racial wealth gap than Warren's plan does. Full cancellation would almost certainly do much more to benefit the millennials, the generation that's been hardest hit by student debt and is the largest percentage of the workforce. Full cancellation will almost certainly do much more to help black workers who are experiencing twice the unemployment of white workers. There are other benefits to cancellation too. It is easier to explain to voters. Its million job advantage makes it easier to build support among people who have never gone to college or acquired student debt, groups that might otherwise resent student debt cancellation. It would stimulate more economic growth with greater advantages for the entire economy, including investors, and it wouldn't be subject to gaming the way Warren's plan would be. That is, children would claim to live elsewhere. People would move taxable income from year to year. Couples would defer marriage, etc. Senator Warren has many impressive policy proposals and is very possibly unaware of the differing impact of a means-tested student debt plan on working people. There is every reason to hope she will reconsider after reviewing the advantages of a broader proposal and join with Senator Sanders in supporting full student debt cancellation. I'm afraid I don't agree with RJ about the reasons to hope. I suspect that Senator Warren has been made aware of the facts that you present here, or at least the point of view that you have presented here concerning the economics of the elimination of student debt. But, I also believe that when Senator Warren approaches things, she approaches those things from the viewpoint that she doesn't expect to have a Senate and a House that will be continuously and heavily influenced by a mass movement that is out there supporting her proposals. I don't know if I even believe that Senator Warren, after mobilizing people into a grassroots campaign for her, which is what she's trying to do now, that if that grassroots campaign is successful in driving her to the presidency, that she would, after that time, continue to maintain the grassroots movement that she created rather than take a page out of Obama's book and deactivate that particular grassroots movement. Yes, I call attention now to the fact that Obama was swept into office by Obama for America. As soon as he got into office, he deactivated the movement because he didn't want it interfering with his bargaining with the right wing and with other centrist figures. His bargaining to keep the elites in power while keeping things from getting out of control. That's what he was about. And there are many signs that Senator Warren is about that too. That that's what her candidacy, okay, is really about. So again, this feeds back. Who would FDR endorse? I don't believe for a minute that he would endorse Elizabeth Warren. He would be part of our movement, our revolution, endorsing Bernie Sanders. So, that is my say for tonight. What I'd like to do now is remind you to please share, like, and subscribe, and please become a patron at www.patreon.com/Joe_Firestone. And then I'd like to go back to Facebook and see what you've been saying and what you've been thinking while I have gone through this. There we are. Okay, let me go back to the beginning. Robin Halsey says, was watching a classic movie about 1942, and an actor's line included, "Yeah, that will go to my socialist security." So conservatives vilified FDR and the New Deal as socialists back then too. Yes, they did. In fact, they probably did that less so in World War II than they did during the 1930s, just after the major reforms were passed. Gregory Mallett says, Rupert Murdoch also owns media outlets in Australia and in the UK. In fact, Murdoch is Australian. That's where he originally made his fortune, if I am not mistaken. He tried to get a foothold in Canada, but the Canadians would not let him get a foothold because they have a law there which I'm told requires a certain amount of factuality from news sources, okay, in Canada. Okay, and in other words, they're not completely free to lie. And as I understand it, this called off the expansion of Murdoch into Canada. Can you imagine? Can you believe that? That's the story I heard anyway. I hope true. I hope it's true. If it is, it speaks very well for the Canadians. And Greg says Fox News was just banned in Canada. Well, okay, I don't think they had a media outlet in Canada, did they, Greg? I think it was probably Fox News broadcasts coming from the United States. And in replying to Gregory, Robin Halsey says, I don't think, though, that they'll let him air a whack job news show in the UK. They know what the hell is up and place controls on brainwashing. Greg says Fox News was just banned in Canada. Steve Wolfbrand says, hi, Dr. Joe. And Steve Wolfbrand says, shared. Thank you, Steve. And Elizabeth Bergen, by Netherlands, has joined. Thank you, Elizabeth. And Steve Wolfbrand said, shared to a bunch of weird groups. The doctor needs a bigger audience. Thank you, Steve. And Greg says, yes, he does, and more shares. Greg says, don't forget to invite friends to join the stream either. Lana Dell has joined. Hi, Lana. And Steve says, Obama sucked. I fell for it twice. Lana Dell said, me too. Well, I only fell for it the first time, but the second time, I grudgingly voted for that putz, knowing full well everything that had happened and criticizing him nonstop from early in 2009 right up to the election of 2012. And Greg Mallet said, I never once voted for Obama. I went for Gary Johnson in 2012. I laugh out loud. Well, I'm not sure Gary Johnson would have been any kind of improvement over Obama. And certainly Mitt Romney would not have. Steve Gonzo joined Lana says, eek, libertarian guy. Glad you've learned MMT since then. Yeah, I used to vote Republican too before I was a Bernie supporter in 2015. Yeah, Bernie got a lot of people on his side. And Suzanne Ryan has joined. Hi, Suzanne. Very nice to see you. And Steve Wolfbrand says, my phone died, and then I'm back. I guess it was just the battery that needed plugging in. Ernest Jones has joined, and welcome to you, Ernest. And Steve Wolfbrand says, yes, preach, Joe. Where's Rob Rivera? He hasn't been here for a while. Steve Wolfbrand said, Bernie's democratic socialism would ignite our economy. Susan Eldridge has joined. Hey, Susan. Susan says, when I'm making calls or knocking doors for Bernie, I love it when people ask, how are you going to pay for it? Lana says, especially when they think you don't have the answer. Susan says, the MMT community has taught me well, and no one has ever tried to argue that I'm wrong. Well, yeah, because they don't have enough knowledge to argue that you're wrong. They're just being smart, Alex. They think it's obvious how you're going to pay for it. Susan says they're very accepting of it because it makes much more sense than the tax and spend nonsense. Barbara Warnig has joined. Hey, Barbara, nice to see you. Steve Wolfbrand says Bernie fucking Sanders. I leave it there. Randy Hedgebeth has joined. Hey, Randy. Here, my Facebook keeps switching to French. Is that right? And Steve says, replying to Susan, we killed the military industrial complex. Steve says, nice group of peeps here. Well, thank you, Steve. I agree. It's a very nice group, of peeps here. It's been a very nice group of peeps for a long time. And Randy's been around a long time. Okay, any other questions or comments? So, I noticed I forgot to put the links up in the description tonight. Once this ends, I will edit the description and provide you with the links so that you can have tonight's links as well. Steve says, I'm a newbie. Well, you're not that new, Steve. It's been at least a few months since I've been seeing your happy icon. Elizabeth says, it's always going to be a nice group when you are following Dr. Joe. Thank you, Elizabeth. Susan says, what do you think of Elizabeth Warren's labor plan compared to Bernie's? Well, I still haven't had very much chance to go over it and to directly compare it to Bernie's plan. It's getting very good press, at this point. It does seem to be a considerable reform, but I think that Bernie's reform is more fundamental than Warren's reform. I also do not know to what extent you can set the reforms side by side, because though they're kind of similar subject matters, there are other parts of Bernie Sanders' agenda that relate to workplace democracy very strongly, and that are not a part, of Warren's agenda. So, in order to fairly compare the two, you would have to mention the parts, the portions of the rest, of Bernie's agenda that address the problems that Warren is calling attention to. And I think if you included those, then Bernie's agenda would certainly be superior to her agenda, though the particular title, uh, the workplace plan, okay, or the labor plan, might not be so clearly superior. So that's why I have to go over the two of them rather carefully, because the issues spill over to other parts of the agendas they have. Okay, and Bernie's his viewpoint is superior in those other aspects. For example, the Green had New Deal. The strength of Bernie's proposal ensures a labor market that is going to be very, very tight. Now that's going to help the power of workers in the workplace. Also, Warren is not so committed to full employment as is Bernie. She doesn't have a job guarantee plan. The existence of the job guarantee is also going to contribute to full employment and is also going to strengthen the hand of workers in the workplace. Furthermore, the emphasis in Bernie's plan on cooperatives, that's not present in Warren's plan. And that's, of course, going to strengthen the influence of the workers in the workplace all over the country. Also, what I didn't see in Warren's plan, actually right off the bat, was an explicit commitment to repeal, what is it, Section 14D? I'll check. I looked it up this afternoon. Let me check my conversation with you, Susan, to see if I can find it. Yes, here it is. Here's my conversation with you. Nope. Sorry, it's taking a little while to come in. Yeah, Section 14B of the Taft Hartley Act. Bernie Sanders has made an explicit commitment to repeal that and therefore to invalidate the right to work aspect of things, to disempower the right to work law almost entirely. Now, it's not clear to me that Warren's bill is actually saying that. In other words, her bill seems to be saying that she's going to stop the ability, okay, of any more states to become right to work states. I'm not sure she's quite saying that she's going to basically repeal the right to work laws in those states that have already got such laws. But I'm sure that Bernie is saying that, okay, in his proposal. So I think that's different. I think that's different. So right now, at first glance, I certainly like the Bernie's agenda with respect to this subject matter better than Warren's. And I think I like his workplace democracy ideas better too. because they involve an emphasis on cooperatives. And Steve Wolfbrand says, join your local DSA chapters. I joined, haven't been to meetings, just joined to show support in numbers. Steve says it's free. And Steve says, this is your best show yet, not sure why. Yeah, I'm not sure why, but thank you, Steve. I have the feeling my shows have been getting better. Sane or saying? I'm not sure which. I'm not sure of the context, Steve. Sometimes my sane like sane. Good point. Anyway, thank you for saying that. I'm not sure if it's my best show yet. It's certainly one I enjoyed very much. Thank you for coming. I think now, though, I'm going to have to say good night. So have a very good night. I am going to end this stream.